Reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity, this is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. It is very wonderful to see you. Hop on in here. Thanks so very much for joining our little community of folks who are fascinated by science and want to learn about gender diversity together. Oh, I just so love that we get to do this. And today, much like every time we come together, we take a question posed, as they often are, in the form of confident declaration from a public figure talking about gender diversity, and then we treat it as the question that we know it was intended to be, and we do our best to see if we can't look to the literature to find some scientific consensus around an answer to that question. This week, our question comes from journalist and teacher in the UK, Debbie Hayden, who's an openly transgender woman and who speaks quite openly about her own experience and has some unusual perspectives on the transgender experience and how we should be working with gender diverse children and young people. Let's take a listen. Here's Debbie Hayden.
The gender clinics are getting referrals from children who are aged 3, 4, 5. And then you've got to ask the question, why are parents doing this? What are parents seeing in their children to actually do this? Are they seeing gender non-conforming behaviour? This is the question. This is where parents need to be challenged. Why do you think your child is trans? Well, my son, or whatever language they use, prefers to wear dresses. Well, why can't boys wear dresses? And the question should be saying of parents is, do you have a problem with your son wearing dresses? Because my worry is that parents have issues about children exhibiting gender non-conforming behaviour, and this is a way of helping the parents address their issues. Better to have a gender-conforming daughter than a gender non-conforming son, perhaps.
Many thanks to Debbie Hayden for her question here. It's a fascinating question as well. Now, of course, Debbie's making some confident declarations about the possibility that parents might be engaging in their children in transition as a response to their sort of their expressed gender rather than their gender identity. But under the surface, this question, I think, speaks very closely to a question that Green posited in 2017. Now, Green is an American sexologist, was an American sexologist, very sadly died a few years ago. And Green basically posited this particular question, right? And I think Debbie Hayden's question here speaks to the same idea. Are people, like transgender children, are children who transition different from those who don't transition even before they transition? Or does the act of transition make them more transgender, right? So let's take the question of whether, if you have a young person who's assigned male at birth, who shows more typical female preferences and interests, do we find that parents are kind of stepping ahead of their children and are making them transgender by helping them to engage in and to sort of experience the sort of feminine side of themselves? Or is this young person different somehow from other young, children assigned male at birth? And therefore, is this young person sort of trans even before they transition? Is transitioning a response to a distinct difference in how a person identifies in terms of gender? Or is it a cause of, does it contribute to how somebody identifies in terms of their gender? It's a really important question. And both, Debbie Hayden's question here is as sort of confidently declared as it was, and Green's question in 2017 are really interesting and useful questions. And I think it also speaks to the question that was posited by the Cass review. For anybody who knows about this field, the Cass review is an independent review that has been commissioned to review how we treat children and young people who are transgender and gender diverse more broadly. And the interim report from the Cass review said a bunch of stuff that's really interesting. I encourage you to go check it out, although we wait with bated breath for the actual review itself. But in the interim review, Hilary Cass said that social transition is not a neutral act. Now, that's an interesting point to be made, and it speaks again to this same question. Is social transition, is sort of that young person assigned male at birth exploring their femininity likely to make them more trans, likely to make them more trans, more likely to transition, or is transition a response to a more significant cross-gender identification for those children? Now, our journey together here begins with the legendary work of Celine Gilgoes, honestly one of my favorite researchers that I've come across. Celine Gilgoes and Christina Olsen, just amazing to watch their work take place. I promise if I saw Celine Gilgoes in reality, I think I'd probably just pass out, and I will need you to save me. Basically, we're going to take a look at Celine Gilgoes a good few times, I think, in this podcast. This piece of research is pretty outstanding. 2019, Similarity in Transgender and Cisgender Children's Gender Development, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So it's pretty prestigious, and with good reason. This piece of research was conducted with over 300 transgender children, and they took a look at really two big things. They wanted to look at whether transgender children's gender development was similar to control children, matched age, at the similar age to the transgender cohort, control children, and to the siblings of the transgender cohort who were the same gender as the gender that with which the transgender cohort identified. So we have like trans guys, these young boys assigned female at birth, compared to control boys who are assigned male at birth and their male siblings, right? And they have trans girls, these kids assigned male at birth, but identifying as girls in the world, and matched to the same age control girls who are assigned female at birth and their sort of female siblings. And these researchers, Gilgoes and colleagues, fascinating stuff. They wanted to look not only at these young people's explicit kind of gender experiences, like clothing preferences, toy preferences, peer preferences. They asked them about how similar they felt to people of the gender with which they identified. They asked them about how similar they felt to people of different genders. And they asked them then about their implicit gender identity. Now, this is really interesting. So not only were they asking them explicitly about toy and clothing and peer preferences, etc., to compare, do trans girls and cisgender girls, are they very similar to one another in those factors? But also they asked them to associate implicitly the concept of self with the concept of female or male. And using an implicit association test, they took a look at how easily a person associated those ideas. And that's kind of fascinating. So the implicit association test is very difficult to fool, right? It's not under any real conscious control. For sure, there is some kind of question about what the implicit association test really measures. And it's a bit of a controversial approach, but it's the only approach that we can use here that has, we don't have any conscious control over it. So children can't really engage in any kind of experimenter bias effects, for example. So there's no expectancy effects where they're thinking that the researcher knows, they know what they think the researcher is expecting and they answer in accordance with that. That's a very common problem in sort of self-report research. Or social desirability either, where young people wanting to please people will answer in what they think are socially desirable ways rather than in truly honest ways. Self-report measures are always a bit tricky, and implicit association tests undermine those effects pretty nicely. Now, there were two big differences between transgender children and their sort of siblings and control children of the same gender with which those children identified. There were two big differences. One, transgender children had a stronger sort of clothing preference than their sort of control peers. What's really interesting is that the longer that they had transitioned, the transgender population of children, young people, their sort of more strong clothing preferences started to wane the longer that they had transitioned, which is kind of interesting. But there was a bit of a difference there. So they had slightly stronger clothing preferences, and they had slightly weaker implicit associations. So while they still sort of implicitly associated, like the transgender girls had a strong implicit association with girl rather than with boy, but it was slightly weaker than for cisgender girls around them, their control counterparts. So it's kind of interesting. But in all other ways, and even those effects are fairly small, still significant, but not huge. In most ways, the transgender children looked remarkably like their cisgender counterparts, which I think is kind of fascinating to me. And it speaks to the idea that, these kids are, for all intents and purposes, the gender with which they identify. There's a clear, Gulgos describes a clear pattern of gender development associated with their current gender, the gender with which they identify, rather than their sex assigned at birth. And it's consistent across all kinds of measures of gender identity, and multiple distinct measures of gender typing, as we described. It includes kind of, sibling, it includes peer preference, clothing preference, toy preference, etc., and lots of behavioral measures too. So we find essentially that transgender girls are very similar in lots of different ways to cisgender girls, and transgender boys are very similar in lots of different ways to cisgender boys. Really interesting. Now, the second thing that they were interested in is whether the act of transition, i.e., children who had transitioned for longer, had a stronger cross-sex identification. Were some of these clothing and toy preferences, or this implicit association, stronger as a consequence of having transitioned longer? I.e., as Green was questioning, does the act of transition exaggerate that cross-gender identification? And they find that no, essentially it doesn't. So Celine Gulgos and colleagues describe in quite clear terms here, a 10-year-old transgender girl, for example, who was labeled a boy at birth and raised for 9 years as a boy, a 10-year-old transgender girl who is labeled a boy at birth and raised for 5 years as a boy before transitioning a little earlier, and a 10-year-old cisgender girl, sibling or control, who was labeled a girl at birth and was raised for a full 10 years as a girl, did not significantly differ in their identification and preferences on the assessed measures. So the duration of their transition of these young people, whether they were, if we compare a 10-year-old transgender girl who was labeled a boy at birth and raised for a full 9 years as a boy and transitioned in the last year, and we compare them to a 10-year-old transgender girl who was labeled a boy at birth and raised for 5 years as a boy before transitioning 5 years ago, those two kids don't differ on any major variable here. Slightly, they differ on clothing preferences. We do see a slightly significant difference in clothing preferences. The longer that a child had transitioned, the weaker their clothing preferences were. They just didn't have quite as strong preferences as they once did. So this is kind of fascinating to me. It has pretty good evidence to suggest that the act of transition did not inform how people experienced their gender to be. They weren't becoming more trans as a consequence of social transition. Now, Ray and colleagues in 2019 conducted another really, really interesting study. And I think this is the same research group, essentially. Like Gulgos and Olsen are, Christine Olsen, I think, is the supervising author here. And this is Ray's work. But, again, the same research group. Just wonderful to see them doing this work. This one's called Predicting Early Childhood Gender Transitions in Psychological Science. Another really interesting study. And essentially what they did was they took a group of, I think, something like 86 gender non-conforming children at quite young age. And they basically took a look at these children and asked about their gender identity and preferences, their peer preferences, toy and clothing preferences, looked at gender similarities, their gender identity, and then and a bunch of demographic data. And what they did was they took a look at which of these children then later, going back some years later, they looked at whether these children had socially transitioned at a later date. And they tried to, so this is kind of a lagged study, they looked at the early kind of gender identification and took a look at whether that could predict which children would go on to later socially transition and which wouldn't. Now, I've got to bear in mind that these are very kind of, this is a very broad definition of cross-gender interest, right? These are sort of gender non-conforming kids. They're, not all of them are going to be trans. And in fact, there's 5 studies in the 1980s that took this broad, gender non-conformity and found that most of those kids don't grow up to be transgender adults. And that's the similar similar here. And when they had the data about these gender non-conforming kids 2 years after the start of the study, on average, they found that the vast majority were non-transitioners. So 49 of those taken in, of the 85 in the study, were non-transitioners, and 36 had gone on to transition. Now, they define transition as essentially taking on the pronoun of the gender with which they identify, as different from the one that was assigned at birth. Those are considered sort of total transitioners. Steensma's own, I think, definition of what you would call total transition, at least social transition. And they matched these kids to transgender controls and to cisgender controls. And that allowed them to do a couple of things, right? They could take a look at the children and their cross-gender interests and cross-gender identification at an early age, and use that to predict whether or not children would go on to transition. And then they could compare them to transgender and cisgender controls as they did so. Really interesting. And they found a couple of things. They found that the degree of gender identification and preferences expressed by gender nonconforming children predicted which children would later go on to socially transition. For example, assigned males that had stronger feminine gender identities and preferences were more likely to be living as girls 2 years later than assigned males who exhibited less strong feminine identities and preferences. Fascinating stuff. Now, stated differently, they say, an assigned male, somebody assigned male at birth, who will later go on to transition to live as a girl, is roughly as feminine before transition as a transgender girl is after transition. And both are comparable in degree of feminine identity and preference to a non-transgender girl. So this is super, super fascinating to me. What Ray and colleagues are highlighting in what is admittedly a reasonably small-scale study, they're finding that they can predict which children go on to later transition through their early identification. And what they find is that what predicts their social transition is that children with stronger nonconformity, with stronger gender identification and preferences, those kids go on to transition more frequently. Transition is a response to stronger cross-sex identification, not necessarily a cause of it. And indeed, what we find is that those kids, long before they transition, right, 2 years before they go on to transition, those kids, they have as strong, they're very similar in their sort of gender identification and preferences, both to transgender children who are discreetly transgender, who go on to transition, and to cisgender girls or cisgender people of the gender with which these kids identify. So what we find is that, for sure, these kids may well be transgender, and that being transgender is not a response to the act of social transition. Christina Olsen in 2015 made this beautiful quote. She says, "While future studies are always needed, our results support the notion that transgender children are not confused, delayed, showing gender atypical responding, pretending, or oppositional. They instead show responses entirely typical and expected for children with their gender identity." So now, while in Olsen and Ray and Gulgoz's work, they take a look at gender identification and gender preferences as two sides of a similar coin, I think it is helpful for us to keep gender expression and gender identity as separate concepts. And the reason is because of work like Frieson's and Meyer-Balberg's. Now, Friesen, 2009, basically took a look at women with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is a very discrete group of women who have increased levels of androgens, such as testosterone and cortisol, in people assigned female at birth otherwise, right? And what they find, Friesen's work, is that it's more common for women in the more severe genotype groups to hold a male-dominated job and to have male-typical hobbies, such as rough sports. So what's really interesting here is that people with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, particularly in the more severe genotype, with increased levels of androgens in their bodies, will end up like at least there's a greater chance of them winding up in more male-dominated hobbies, sports, and jobs. But here's what's really interesting, right? Mayor Balberg in 2004 took a look at gendered behavior, but also incorporated gender identity, looking at the gender identity and gendered behavior, much as Christine Olsen and colleagues did, but in girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And they found that while the behavior and interests of these girls tended to be more typically masculine, as was found by Friesen, this did not extend to altering the gender identity of these girls, who did not show the dysphoria or gender confusion that would otherwise have been expected if their experience would shape their gender identity. So here's a classic example of us needing to make a distinction between gendered expression and gender identity. Gender expression is the personal and social performance of one's gender, right? Mayor Balber, it's definitely shaped by things that are somewhat in our control and clearly somewhat out of our control, right? These young people didn't choose to have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and the increased testosterone sort of drew them into more masculine sports and hobbies and jobs. But it did not shape their gender identities. So we find, again, important when we talk about gender identity, that's right, that feels like home, that's what I am. It's useful, meaningful to keep that separate from gendered expression. So let's summarize a little bit where we got to. So our question today, Debbie Hayden, are children engaging in transition because, as a consequence of a difference in gender expression, and then sort of is that shaping their gender identity in some way? It looks like that definitely isn't the case here. Big studies, hundreds of participants overall, and we're taking a look, and it looks very much like the children who transition do so because of a stronger cross-gender identification rather than do so and create a stronger cross-gender identification. It seems that when we take a look at the sort of gendered preferences as well as the gender identity, including the implicit association of these kids, there are a group of kids out there legitimately who are girls in the world in all the ways that matter, including how they identify. And those kids are very similar to non-transgender girls around them. And those kids will engage in transition, or at least may well engage in transition, if that cross-gender identification is strong enough. And that is a response to that cross-gender identification, because they kind of are girls in the world. Similar for trans guys. There's a bunch of kids out there who are trans guys in the world, who are very similar to other boys, very similar in age to them, in all the ways that matter, who then will develop and may well choose to transition in order to help them to feel happier in the world as the gender with which they identify. Now, you might ask a really important question here. So what the blazes is gender identity, and why are there a bunch of kids out there who experience such strong cross-gender identification? Why is there this group of kids who have gender identities that are different to the sex they're assigned at birth? I don't know the answer to that question, but I will say this. It looks like gender is simply quite broad and diverse. So when we have these kind of kids with strong cross-gender identification, they may simply represent one sort of strong end of quite a range of gender experiences. Martin and colleagues in 2017 asked 467 pupils from 4 to 10 years of age about their gender identities. Now, they used a very visual method of doing this, asking participants to compare themselves to typical girls and typical boys. This is very similar to Bem's original work that looked at masculinity and femininity as two spectra. So this is very similar to that, but it's not asking them to look at masculinity and femininity so much as asking them to compare themselves to typical boys and typical girls. But very similar to Bem, they found that people could find themselves in 4 different places. This is a big spectrum of gender experiences. They found that the majority of folks, 48%, I realize that's not the majority, but by far it's the biggest group of the 4, these kids have a same gender identification. So they identify more strongly with typical girls if they were assigned female at birth, or typical boys if they were assigned male at birth. Now, 30% had a sort of strong both gender identification, right? They associated both with typical girls and typical boys. 30%. So it's quite a lot, right? And this isn't a pathological position. This is simply part of the gender spectrum. The majority of people, like more people than anyone else, than any other position, find themselves same gender identified, but a good number of people, 30%, find themselves both gender identified. 17% found themselves neither gender identified. So they were like low similarity to typical girls and to typical boys. And 6% found themselves to some extent cross gender identified. So they felt themselves more similar to typical girls, even though they were assigned male at birth, or vice versa. That's not to say that those cross-gender identified kids are like either in a pathological position, and it's not to say that they are necessarily transgender. What we might suggest from all of this synthesized work together is that in that 6%, there's going to be a small portion of people, about 0.5% probably, whose cross-gender identification is strong enough that it might provoke some kind of social transition in order to make themselves feel okay in the world, to alleviate the distress that that position might otherwise lead to. Now, this is a cracking paper generally. I really enjoy it. But what I find really interesting is that Martin's study found generally positive affective consequences for being members of rarer positions on this spectrum. Now, that's similar to other work around BEM's own spectra, right? And they found that, there are generally positive outcomes. Now, we're taking a look at some of the synthesis from some of this other work around BEM, what people generally find is that there's a sort of cognitive flexibility that seems to be associated with this both gender and neither gender and cross-gender identification. But what Martin found, which I find super interesting, is that cross-gender identified children experience the highest levels of social anxiety. And both cross-gender and low gender similarity groups, so people who either experience themselves as cross-gender identified or neither gender identified, experienced low levels of belongingness. So kids cross-gender identified had high levels of social anxiety, and both cross-gender identified and neither gender identified groups reported low levels of belongingness. Martin's conclusion: there are advantages, they say, to feeling as though you belong strongly and exclusively to a culturally normative group. Here we have evidence that gender minority groups without strong cultural representation need exactly that. We have groups who feel like they have weak sense of belonging, high levels of social anxiety, because they find themselves in culturally counter-normative spaces. And therein lies the rub, right? When we talk about there's this very small group of people who are legitimately transgender, and we separate them out as if they're a very distinct group from everybody else, what we actually do is create a void between those two places where a bunch of people fall, right? What we're finding is that actually gender is much bigger spectrum than trans and cis. We have people who experience strong cross-gender identification who aren't trans. People who experience both identification with masculinity and femininity, or neither. And those are legitimate ways of being in the world, and actually pretty positive, effectively. But who find themselves in a space which is culturally counter-normative. So what we need to do as a culture is to try and create better representation for these rarer places on the gender spectra, not just for the transgender community, but for non-binary, gender fluid communities, and just for a stronger, more reasonable representation in normative culture of the massive and beautiful diversity of genders that exist between and around those spaces. I think actually we can take this one step further. In response to Deborah's amazing question, we can say this, that when we're advocating for prohibiting or at least reducing access to transition-related healthcare, when we're trying to prevent people from being able to express themselves as their true, authentic selves in the world, we create a mental health problem. If we take a look at Denye's review in 2016, they did a review of the literature and found that the mental health of transgender and gender non-conforming populations improves following gender-confirming medical intervention. Now, that's not to say that everybody needs access to medical intervention explicitly, but people should have access to transition-related services where they need it. Now, we can also look at people like Olson. Olson 2016, socially transitioned transgender children who are supported in their gender identity have developmentally normative levels of depression and only minimal elevations in anxiety. Psychopathology is not inevitable in this group, right? So transgender people don't have a mental health problem, and the beautiful sort of gender spectra that sort of exists and all the range of different places that people find themselves in, it becomes a psychopathology when we make it one, right? It becomes a psychopathology when we make it counter-normative. It becomes distressing when we make it difficult for people to exist in the world or to access the healthcare that they need, or to find a space where they can be themselves fully and authentically in the world and find acceptance and find belonging. Finally, Vasey and Bartlett did a bunch of work with the Samoan Fa'afafine communities, a third gender community in Samoa that's very well accepted in mainstream society. Not everywhere in mainstream society because colonialism, and there are some fundamentalist Christian groups that find it hard to accept gender atypical experiences, but in the main, there's a lack of this kind of extreme societal intolerance that we find in more Western societies for gender diverse experiences. Now, Vasey and Bartlett were interested, do these kind of rarer experiences come with distress? Is this just an inherent experience of being gender diverse in the world, or is it a consequence of societal intolerance? Now, they find that in Samoa, that Fa'afafine are not distressed in childhood. They basically ask about kind of, whether a cross-gender identification in childhood, a sense of inappropriateness in the male typical gender role, a discomfort with sex, leads necessarily to distress associated with any of the above. And what they find is that it doesn't, is that it is a societal intolerance that creates a context in which distress might take place, right? Just as we found before, these rarer places associated with anxiety, associated with poor belonging, purely because we live in a society where those places are counter-normative, less well accepted. And they call for us to stop considering gender diversity to be a pathology at all, that people need access to transition-related healthcare for sure, but that we shouldn't consider it any kind of mental health problem to be gender diverse. Because as Vasey and Bartlett say, there is no compelling evidence that cross-gender behaviors or identities in and of themselves cause distress in the individual. Thanks so very much for joining me. This has been Classroom Psychology, and I hope we got to a reasonable answer to this question here, realizing that there are a diverse range of experiences and identities, and that, when we talk about gender identity and gender expression, it might be useful to keep those things separate, but within each, there's a diverse range of experiences, and that the transgender community might just be one end of a diverse, beautiful tapestry of experiences of identities and expressions. Thanks so very much for joining me. You know what? Together, let's see if we can't create a world in which everyone can find a place to belong. Look forward to seeing you in the next one.